All right. Well, we're gonna miss that whole part of the the presentation at the beginning. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about our React Native development process. And if you're new to React Native, this is a good primer on what it's like. Um, so late last year, we started making a shift from a traditional iOS app to a React Native application. Um, and we have the obvious benefit of, yes, um, you can target both Android and iOS, but one of the great benefits of using React Native is that you can leverage your existing web development team to work on the React Native apps. So our app developer pool went from 3 people who can work on the iOS app to 10 plus engineers who can work on the React Native app. And so we have contributions to the React Native app from all over the team, the engineering team. Our backend developers, our web developers, our React Native developers can contribute to this. We have traditional Git flow, which I think is pretty good for our mobile development. We have one master branch, and we create PRs to go into it. There's other teams that have slightly different Git flows, but this is ours. We like to rebase all day, every day, instead of like just merging, like having one master branch and then just coming in the morning or like several times during the day and just advancing your work is just very, very clean. We like very, very clean PRs without any merge conflicts, merge commits, or anything like that. And we have 2 levels of developer reviews. We have a developer review, which ensures code quality, etc. And then we have a QA review, which makes sure that the experience is great for the customer. Let's make sure that we don't have any bugs or anything like that. And then on top of that, we have continuous integration. So whenever we merge something into master, our TeamCity server just runs Fastlane and automatically makes the builds and pushes them to test flight and to Fabric for us to distribute the app internally. So we're constantly testing, what the latest master is, and that's really, really nice for us. And obviously, there's some places where we would like to improve, but we want to go fast. We want to iterate fast. So I want to talk about one of the problems in developing React Native apps is these working on deeply nested scenes. Our app at this point has gotten pretty big. We have places in the app where you have to navigate through 3 or 4 scenes. And what I mean by scenes is kind of like the full screen components that contain functionality for like a card or for like a view. So for example, our search screen is one scene. Our hotel details screen is another scene, etc. So we have hot module reloading to help us with that. If you don't know what hot module reloading is, it's a feature from Webpack, and that also happens to work in the React Native development server, which sends a signal to the client whenever you change the module. So then the client handles it and reloads that module, which could be like a React component. And there's some special magic that happens in the background in React Native. There's a Babel transform that converts a component into a component that can accept hot module reload signals. That hot module reload transfer was made by Dan Abramoff, and it's been pretty nice, but sometimes it's not that great. So one of the issues that we have with working in deeply nested scenes is that we will, in order to get to the screen that we need to work on, we'll start a hotel search, for example, in our app. Then you pick a hotel, and then you scroll all the way down to look at the part of that scene that you want to work on. And you start working on it, and it's nice, and then you hit save, and you expect it to reload, or to reload that little portion of the screen that you just worked on. You make your change, and then it doesn't work because then you realize that you didn't turn on hot module reload. So it's okay. You do like the little shake, etc., and then you have to do that again. You wait forever for the JavaScript transform to happen, and then you're like, okay. This would be fine if you only did it once, if this was a mistake that you did once a day. But one of the things about hot module reload is that it sometimes puts your application in a weird state. And when you get into a weird state, you just have to like reload and kind of like do the navigation dance all over again. And this can happen to you like several times a day. And this slows down development. It's kind of like an annoyance. And if you can get rid of annoyances, then that's great. So kind of like having to deal with that like all the time is not great, Bob, right? So enter Storybook. Storybook is a tool for interactive development, and it's a kind of like a testing environment for building components in isolation. It allows you to develop also a content library that you create over time, and you just have a reference of all the components that you make. And Storybook basically lets you create a list of stories that are essentially testing harnesses for these components. And I'll show you this stuff in a second. I wanted to play with Storybook because I went to ReactConf, I heard all the talks, and it seemed like working on a component in isolation would be very interesting. And then I realized, at this point, I had never actually done this in my career, work on a UI element by itself. It's always been, as you're working on the whole web page at the same time, and you kind of like have to reload the entire page, and certain things like automatic refresh and like hot module reload help, but you're never actually working on components in isolation. You're always working on it as part of the bigger product. So I've been putting buttons on web pages and mobile apps for a really long time, and this is just a very interesting concept. If you want to install Storybook in your React Native, in your existing React Native project, it's very easy. All you have to do is install the Storybook CLI, and then type in your project get Storybook, and it will do all the magic of setting up the Storybook tool. And then to get Storybook running, you essentially just do npm run Storybook. And what that will do is it will start up a Webpack server that's different from the React Native development server, that will deliver a different JavaScript file than your application file to the app. And the app is just loading whatever JavaScript file it gets from the localhost 8081. So that's where Storybooks comes in and just delivers like a nice testing framework that you can load up in your app. And I'll show you this right now. So let's see if we can escape out of this. Can I escape out of this? What's the short? Can't see anything. So I have my emulator right here, and I'm going to load up Storybook here. And I'm just going to reload this for a second. What Storybook gives you is this nice web page where it shows you the list of stories that you've written. And I'll show you what this looks like in a second. But this is essentially your component library. And when you click on the components, or sorry, on the stories, you can see the application updated. And you can take a look at some of the different concepts. So let me see if I can, whoops. That's not great. There you go. Yeah, I'm not gonna split my screen here for a second, or mirror the screen. But let's see if we can search for some of these components. So hotel marker. So this is a component that I recently had to work on that is just essentially a marker with different props. And these are, I guess, your stories that essentially run your component with different props. It's really nice when you want to test, when you want to do things like standalone animation. So oops, yeah, let's take a look at header animated. This is one animation that we made, and it's really nice. It's awesome that you can just make these things without having to load up your entire application, etc. It's very nice to focus. We can have some more complex examples like Lola View Pager, which is something that I made. This is a more complex story that shows you components. This component that I built, that's essentially just a view pager, and it has to work differently on iOS and Android. This is just one of the different capabilities of React Native between the platforms. And here's an example of the story of this component controlled by props. And I can just move, and it will update the parent. So it's really nice to be able to set this stuff up. One of the things that I really like about Storybook is that it has a really nice community built around it. And somebody made this thing that's awesome. Let's close this. This is an annoyance. Like this webpage, it takes up too much space and it distracts from my code. So I'm just gonna pull up VS Code here, and as you can see, I have Storybook integrated into VS Code. So I can just go look through my stories, and I can just change what I'm working on, which is really, really cool. Another cool thing that I like about Storybook is that it can actually control the two different platforms at the same time. So let me see if I can pull this up and get it working. So, oops. That's a story that's not well written. But let's take a look at some other stuff. And as you can see, I'm showing you my Android device right now that I have connected. And I can change stories and see them on both platforms at the same time, which means that I can develop stuff for both platforms at the same time and make sure that it works, which is really cool. Okay, let's go back to the presentation if I can find it. Let's hope this keeps working. So we started doing building stories, and at first it was just like, oh, I want to play with this cool tool, etc. And then we started realizing that it was changing our process, our development process. So what did we start learning? We plan a lot better now. Before, we used to assign entire scenes as features for one developer, and now we think in terms of components. We separate work in components instead of like entire scenes. And we realized that giving somebody an entire scene to work on is a mistake because scenes actually have several concerns. So there's a Redux concern, right? You probably need to work on the Redux portion of it. You need to build the container that connects Redux to your component. There's layout concerns, and then there's like the basic component concerns. And as we started realizing this, eventually we started separating work by concerns instead of just by components. So let me give you an example of like what a concern or like what a feature for us was. a feature was an entire scene. We would say, Raf, work in this entire scene and just get it done, please. And there's several concerns here. And because you're thinking about this in terms of like one thing, it's very easy to just like, mix everything up and build, spaghetti code. Once we started thinking in components, our planning was a lot better. Starting from our sketch mock-ups during our sprint planning, we would actually take the extra time to separate things into components. And this process took a little bit longer, but it's totally worth it. And the things that we argue about during these meetings is mainly like, what are we going to call these components? Like, what are the names, right? We have different philosophies, and we spent like a long time. But once we figure that out, we know exactly what we need to work on. So these are the concerns that typically go into a scene, right? You have your Redux store stuff, you have your Redux container, you have a scene layout, and you have several components. And here I'm just going to highlight, these things in different colors are the things that can be worked on by different developers at the same time. Instead of one developer working on this entire thing, you can throw multiple bodies at it and get it done quicker. Let's go back to the demo, and I'll show you some of the interesting things that we've done past this stage. So I'm going to show you this thing called Skeletor. Skeletor is this component that I build, and it has a cool name, Skeletor. It's, I mainly thought of the name first, and then I built a component. I just wanted to build it just so I could have a component named Skeletor. One of the things that we realized is that we would give the task to build components to some people, and then we would give the task to build out the scene to other people, right? But we want those to go parallel. And we found you can't really build a scene if you don't have the components. Like you don't want to say like, oh, I can't work on this because I'm missing the components. Hurry up. So we built this component called Skeletor that is essentially a placeholder, so that people can start working on the layout. And all this component does is, it takes whatever props you want to give it, it takes a name, and then when you click on it, it shows you this little window right here that shows you the exact props that it's taking. So the person in charge of connecting the components in a scene doesn't have to have the components in order to do that. Let me see if I can look at this. Is that it? Yeah. So can people see this? Is that too big? Yeah. So basically we have a component that we're importing from our components library. By the way, Atticus taught me a cool trick to avoid this, avoid doing this whole thing. Talk to him afterwards. I'll have to talk to him afterwards to remember. But yeah, we import this component called Skeletor, and we just we use it all over our layout, right? Skeletor, we give it a component name and we give it some props, etc. Whatever props we're going to give that container or the component that's eventually going to go in there. And then the neat thing is that you can import Skeletor as the name of the component that you're waiting for, which is awesome. And as you can see right here, I'm waiting for header primary to be done. And then once that's done, all I need to do is this. Just delete this part, go like that, and boom. My Skeletor component that used to be there is now replaced by the updated component. So this is a really neat way of parallelizing work. You can get to shipping a full feature much faster if you organize the bodies that are going to work on it. Another scenario that I want to show you guys, I didn't have time to prepare this, is talking about the container concern. We have some components that we're including into some of their stories in Storybook that depend on Redux. They have containers in them. And when we first started putting these stories into Storybook, we had this error that like, hey, there's no store, right? You need to set up a store in order to be able to use this component because it's a connected component. And this is one example. So in order to get this component to work, all you have to do is just add a provider and a store, and you call create store with just like, nothing on it. And that's enough to get a store into your Storybook so that your component won't complain. And this is the part that I wish I had more time to prepare. But there's a realization that comes from this, which is you can work on the container. You can start working on the Redux container without actually having the Redux store. So you could potentially here just make up some random store that just happens to have the structure that you're eventually going to have in your Redux store. Have somebody make the container and then have somebody else just work on Redux without having to worry about like how it's going to get connected, etc. And that's the best way to work on Redux, right? Redux is supposed to be this kind of like headless app that you just somehow attach to the UI, but it's supposed to be a standalone app. And this part is really cool, and we've done it in development. I don't have anything that I can show you right now, but it's really, really nice to be able to do that. All right, back to the presentation. So what were the speed up benefits? A scene or like an entire feature used to be 1 or 2 big PRs made by one person, which were really big. They were hard to review. And now that we have Storybook, we can create a scene with like 7, 8 PRs made by entirely different people, and those PRs are smaller and easier to review. The other awesome thing is that we don't need to QA every PR now, because a lot of the PRs are just Storybook PRs. Storybook does not go into your product whatsoever. It's an entirely separate testing harness. So it's okay to just merge new components into master. If you're just playing with them in Storybook. Once you actually put this into your product, then we have a QA review. The PRs can just have the Storybook link in them in order to demonstrate, hey, I made this component and it works and it's awesome. And obviously, it helps our planning our sprint, much. It helps a lot. And what happens is that because we're working on these components in isolation, then it means that the contract between components, meaning like which props the component's going to take, that's much more well defined, because it's seen standalone. It's not part of like this bigger sea of things. And what's awesome is that eventually you build a component library over time. So as you build more features, you say, oh, I think we already have this component, so I'm just gonna take that and put that into my next scene that I'm building. And this is what a PR looks like, and I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. Does this work? Oh, there we go. Oh. So a PR, our PRs have an intent. They talk about what the component contract is. It has a link to the Storybook URL, and it has like a little preview of what the component looks like. And we find that this helps the PR process a lot. how do I? There we go. So some takeaways from this. Stories are testing, slash development slash showcase harnesses for your components. Storybook puts modularity front and center. And if you want to have like a very clean, maintainable code base, you need to make sure that you put an emphasis on modularity. And you'll have higher quality code. Storybook lets you break down work by components. It has awesome integration into VS Code. Our developers who use Vim are very jealous of this. I'm sure somebody will eventually write a plugin for Vim or something, but it's only for VS Code right now. And you can make stories for not just components, but for layouts and Redux containers, etc. Yeah, and I think that's it. Thank you. Do you guys have any questions? Yes.
Has this changed how you guys approach your kind of the organization of your files? You see that?
Not yet. We do have kind of like this external stories folder, and I can show you like what the structure of that is a little bit. So we kind of have like the storybook folder, and we have our stories, but our components are still like in source component slash shared, etc. Like our components right now are a little bit messy. We're working on eventually reorganizing that. Right now we're actually in the middle of a launch. Like we gotta launch an app tomorrow. But after we're done with that, like we'll take the time to reorganize the project a little bit. Yes.
Have you run into any issues rendering native children, like children that might be native modules, in the context of Storybook, or do those just kind of?
They just work. So I can see why this question is important, because you're running the story in the device. The native modules will just work. That's not true of tests, and that's a common issue in React Native. Like there's a lot of native components that you use when writing code, and if a function uses a native module, when you run it in Node, when you test that function in Node, Node doesn't have any notion of native modules or anything like that. So your test will fail. But in Storybook, because you're just running the thing on a device, it will just work.
So yeah, makes sense. Because like to a degree, obviously everything is native, right?
Yeah.
So what if you have certain components that maybe require, like certain native components that require more upfront configuration?
It's up to you to. Again, it's kind of like the same thing as with tests. In tests, if you have upfront configuration, you often mock the modules, etc. You're gonna have to do a little bit of setup if your component requires things to already exist. But stories, because they're just JavaScript files, you can do that the same way as you would in your app. And actually, we do that like in some components. Some of our more complex components that I didn't show you require like a Redux store that is already initialized with certain stuff. And we just run the same initialization code as we would in our main app. Yep. Yeah.
So recently, we started taking a little bit of a different approach to our screens and our app. We used to have just like the sea of things we're talking about. Your connected screen with the layout right there. And think about breaking it apart much more there. So you just have your layout scene, and then you have your connector that attaches to that. So with that scenario where your scene is really just a layout of other components, are you putting your scenes in Storybook too, or just like the individual pieces?
We're actually putting some scenes in Storybook, because scenes are just components, right? That was the awesome part of this. In my mind, scenes are a little bit differently. They're a little bit different from components. Scenes take up the entire screen. We can just make stories for the scenes themselves. And when I talk about layout, that's what I'm talking about. Like the scene is in charge of like laying out a bunch of components. And a scene doesn't necessarily need to be wrapped in a container. A scene can just be a collection of stuff that, components that are contained, that have their own containers. And in that case, you can still do the same thing that we're doing here, which is, wrap your scene in a provider and just give it some, like, either the real Redux store that you use or some mock Redux store. Yes, more questions?
So as somebody who is very interested in doing this, I've been looking at Storybook for a while. What would your advice be for a team that doesn't use this and wants to introduce it, but we're already very feature focused right now that we need to figure out how to incorporate it at a low cost?
I would say, the benefit to us has been enough that I would advise, take a day off feature work and actually set this up. And you can start out with one component. You can start out with one story. You don't need to start making stories for everything. You don't need to stop existing PRs, etc. But if you have like one component that's like a button that you would like to get right, try setting up Storybook. It took me like less than half an hour to actually set up. And you can get started with it in less than like an hour or so. Any other questions? So I'll say one of the things that we would like to get to in the future is having a static storybook for React Native. So once we commit stories to master, we would like our CI server to just generate the storybook and put it online somewhere, so that we're not, as developers who are making scenes that already have made components, like we can just go to a URL and look at the existing components that we have without having to run storybooks ourselves. And I would say Atticus is actually doing some really cool stuff in that regard. And hopefully he'll give a talk about it in the future. All right. Thank you. Thanks a lot.